Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere you might not expect. Not to a dark alley or a crime scene photographed in black and white, but to a place where faith was supposed to matter most. To a community where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the hours, and where a man's word, if he wore the right collar and shook the right hands, could carry him further than truth ever would. I want to take you to Indiana in 1889, to a town called Crawfordsville, and to the farming community of Shawnee Mound that surrounded it. A place where the land rolled gently, where corn grew tall in summer, and where, beneath the surface of Sunday hymns and Masonic handshakes, something terrible was taking root. This is a story about trust, about how we give it, sometimes too freely, to people who know exactly how to perform goodness without ever feeling it. It is a story about a woman named Hattie, who tried to be heard and could not make herself loud enough. And it is a story about a man named William Pettit, a preacher, a mason, a husband, who understood that in a world built on reputation, the appearance of virtue mattered far more than virtue itself. What happened in Shawnee Mound in the summer of 1889 would become one of the most infamous murder cases in Indiana history. But it did not start with poison. It started years earlier, with choices made quietly, with lies told smoothly, with a marriage that died long before anyone thought to save it. And it started, as so many tragedies do, with a community that believed what it wanted to believe, until the truth became impossible to ignore. So let us begin where all stories like this must begin. Not with the crime, but with the people. Not with the ending, but with the ordinary days that came before, when everything still seemed possible, when Hattie Pettit still believed her husband might change, and when William Pettit still believed he could have everything he wanted without ever having to pay for it. Crawfordsville, Indiana, in the late 19th century, was a town that took itself seriously. It was not a frontier outpost, raw and lawless, nor was it a sleepy backwater content to let the world pass it by. It was a place with aspirations, a county seat with brick buildings and gas streetlights, with Wabash College lending it an air of culture and learning, and with enough industry, enough commerce, enough self-regard to believe it mattered. The people of Crawfordsville read newspapers, attended lectures, joined societies. They believed in progress, in education, in the civilizing power of institutions. And no institution mattered more, in the daily lives of the people, than the church. Religion in rural Indiana was not a private affair. It was public, visible, woven into the fabric of social life. To be respectable meant to attend church, to teach Sunday school, to host the preacher for Sunday dinner. Faith was a marker of character, and character was everything. A man's reputation could open doors or close them. It could secure him credit at the bank, a seat in the Masonic lodge, invitations to the homes of people who mattered. And if you were a preacher, if you stood in the pulpit and spoke of salvation and righteousness, then your reputation was not just important, it was sacred. People trusted you with their souls. They trusted you with their secrets, their marriages, their children. They trusted you because they had to, because the whole structure of their moral universe required that a man of God be what he claimed to be. Shawnee Mound, the farming community just outside Crawfordsville, was even more tightly knit. Out there, away from the bustle of town, families had lived on the same land for generations. They knew each other's business, attended the same churches, married into each other's families. It was a world of long memories and firm judgments, where a scandal could follow you for life, and where forgiveness, if it came at all, came slowly. But it was also a world that wanted to believe in goodness, that wanted to trust its leaders, that wanted to think the best of people until given overwhelming reason to think otherwise. Into this world came William F. Pettit. He arrived in Shawnee Mound in the mid-1880s as a Methodist circuit preacher, a man in his early 30s with a commanding presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a strong build and a voice that carried. When he preached, people listened. He had that quality some men possess, a kind of magnetism, an ability to fill a room just by entering it. He was educated enough to quote scripture with authority, charming enough to make people laugh, humble enough, or so it seemed, to admit his own struggles with faith and doubt. He spoke of his difficult childhood, his troubled youth, his redemption through Christ. He spoke of grace, of second chances, of the transforming power of belief. And people loved him for it. Within months of his arrival, Pettit had joined the local Masonic Lodge. Freemasonry mattered in rural Indiana, perhaps even more than the church in some circles. It was a fraternity of respectable men, a network of influence and mutual aid. To be a Mason meant you belonged, that you had been vouched for, that you could be trusted. Pettit rose quickly through the ranks, attending meetings, participating in rituals, making himself indispensable. He was the kind of man who knew how to work a room, how to remember names, how to make each person feel seen and valued. He understood, instinctively, that power in a small community was not about force, but about connection. It was about being the man everyone knew, the man everyone liked, the man everyone wanted on their side. And he was married. That mattered too. A preacher needed a wife, needed the appearance of a stable Christian home. Hattie Pettit was everything a preacher's wife should be. She was quiet, kind, intelligent. She had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, respected in the community, known for her patience with children and her gentle manner. She played the organ at church, taught Sunday school, hosted ladies' aid meetings in her home. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, nodded when she was supposed to nod, and kept whatever unhappiness she felt locked away where no one could see it. Because Hattie was unhappy. Anyone who looked closely might have seen it. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she grew quieter as the years passed, more withdrawn. The way she sometimes flinched when her husband raised his voice. But most people did not look closely. They saw what they expected to see. A devoted wife, a good Christian woman, standing dutifully beside her husband as he built his career, his reputation, his future. What they did not see were the private conversations Hattie had with other ministers, men she trusted, men she hoped might help. She told Reverend Hickman, a fellow Methodist preacher and a kind man, that her marriage was not what it appeared. She said her husband was cold to her, that he drank more than he should, that he disappeared for hours without explanation. She said she felt alone, that she had tried to be a good wife, but that nothing she did seemed to matter. Reverend Hickman listened. He counseled patience, prayer, submission. He believed, as so many did, that marriage was sacred, that divorce was unthinkable, that a woman's duty was to endure, to hope, to trust that God would soften her husband's heart in time. Hattie tried. She prayed. She waited. She buried her loneliness beneath a facade of normalcy and hoped that someday, somehow, things would change. But William Pettit was not thinking about his wife. He was thinking about his future. He was thinking about advancement, about influence, about the life he believed he deserved. And he was thinking about a woman named Clemmy Whitehead. Clemmy was a widow, and she was wealthy. Her late husband, David Mahari, had been one of the largest landowners in the county, a man whose property stretched for miles, whose barns were full, whose name commanded respect. When he died, he left everything to Clemmy, and she managed it shrewdly, competently, without needing a man to tell her what to do. She was in her 40s, still handsome, still vigorous, and she had no intention of fading into the background of widowhood. She was active in the church, active in the community, and she had a mind of her own. She also had a past. There were whispers, quiet but persistent, that Clemmy had not always been faithful during her marriage. There was talk of an affair with a man named Septimus Fata, talk of impropriety, talk of scandal hushed up for the sake of the family's reputation. But nothing had ever been proven, and in the absence of proof, people chose to forget. Clemmy was too important, too wealthy, too useful to the church and the community to be cast aside over rumors. When David Mahari fell ill in the final months of his life, it was William Pettit who came to the house to pray with him, to comfort him, to help him prepare for the end. It was Pettit who sat at Mahari's bedside, listening to the old man's fears and regrets, offering words of consolation. And it was Pettit who helped Mahari revise his will, who brought the lawyer, who witnessed the signing, who made sure everything was in order. No one thought anything of it at the time. A preacher helping a dying man make peace with God, helping him put his affairs in order, that was what preachers did. But later, much later, people would remember. They would remember how often Pettit was at the Mahari house in those final months. They would remember how familiar he seemed with Clemmy, how comfortable in her presence. They would remember the way she looked at him, the way he looked at her, and they would wonder when it started, when the kindness of a minister crossed the line into something else. David Mahari died in early 1889, and the funeral was everything it should have been. Pettit delivered the eulogy, spoke of a life well lived, of faith rewarded, of reunion in heaven. Clemmy sat in the front pew, veiled and solemn, the picture of grief. And then the mourners went home, and life went on, and Pettit began visiting the Mahari house even more frequently than before. He said he was helping Clemmy with estate matters. He said he was providing spiritual support during her time of bereavement. He said a great many things, and because he was a preacher, because he was trusted, people believed him. But the servants saw, the neighbors saw, and slowly, quietly, without anyone quite knowing when it began, the talk started. They were seen together in a buggy, driving out into the countryside in the early evening, just the two of them, no chaperone. They were seen at church functions, standing close, talking in low voices, laughing in a way that seemed too easy, too intimate. They were seen at revival meetings in neighboring towns, traveling together, staying overnight, returning the next day looking tired but happy. And people began to wonder. They began to whisper. They began to ask each other if perhaps the preacher and the widow were closer than propriety allowed. But no one confronted Pettit. Not yet. Because he was a preacher. Because he was a Mason. Because he was admired and respected and trusted. And accusing a man like that of adultery, of violating the sacred trust of his calling, was not something you did lightly. You needed proof. You needed certainty. And all they had were glimpses, fragments, the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Hattie knew. Of course she knew. A wife always knows. She saw the way her husband's mood lifted when he was going to see Clemmy. She saw the way he grew irritable and distant when he was home. She heard the excuses, the explanations, the smooth reassurances that it was all perfectly innocent, that she was imagining things, that she was being unreasonable. And she tried to believe him, because what else could she do? Where else could she go? Divorce was unthinkable. Her family was far away. She had no money of her own, no means of supporting herself. She was trapped, and she knew it, and the knowledge of her own helplessness must have been almost as unbearable as the betrayal itself. She went to Reverend Hickman again. This time, she did not speak in generalities. She told him she believed her husband was unfaithful. She told him about the buggy rides, the late nights, the coldness at home. She begged him to intervene, to speak to Pettit, to do something. Hickman was troubled. He believed Hattie. He had always believed her. But he also knew how dangerous it was to accuse a fellow minister without proof. He promised to speak to Pettit, to counsel him, to remind him of his duties as a husband and a man of God. When Hickman confronted Pettit, the response was exactly what you would expect. Pettit was outraged. He denied everything. He said the accusations were baseless, malicious, the product of small minds and idle gossip. He said his relationship with Clemmy Whitehead was entirely proper, that he was helping her as any minister would help a grieving widow, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was attacking not just him, but the integrity of the church itself. He was so convincing, so indignant, so utterly certain of his own righteousness, that Hickman found himself almost apologizing. Almost, but not quite, because Hickman was a good man, and he knew what he had seen in Hattie's eyes, and he could not quite bring himself to believe Pettit's denials, no matter how forcefully they were delivered. But what could he do? He had no authority over Pettit. They were both circuit preachers, both answerable to the bishop, both supposedly equals in the eyes of the church. He could not force Pettit to change his behavior. He could not force Clemmy to send him away. All he could do was watch, and wait, and hope that somehow, before it was too late, one of them would come to their senses. They did not. If anything, the affair grew more reckless, more open. In June of 1889, Hattie left Crawfordsville. She went to visit family in New York, and everyone understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that she was running away. That she could not bear to stay in a town where everyone knew, where everyone whispered, where her humiliation was a subject of public speculation. She stayed away for weeks, and during that time, Pettit did not even pretend to miss her. He moved into the Mahari house. He slept there. He ate there. He lived there, with Clemmy, as if they were already married, as if Hattie had simply ceased to exist. The servants were scandalized. Ollie Reese, who worked in the Mahari household, would later testify that she saw them together in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. She saw them embrace. She heard them talk about the future, about marriage, about the life they would have together once Hattie was gone. Gone. Not divorced. Not separated. Gone. And Ollie, young and frightened and utterly powerless, said nothing. Because who would believe a servant over a preacher? Who would take her word against his? So she kept her silence, and she watched, and she remembered everything. By the time Hattie returned in early July, the affair was no longer a rumor. It was a fact, known to nearly everyone in Shawnee Mound, discussed in hushed tones in parlors and general stores, a scandal so brazen that even the most charitable interpretations had worn thin. Hattie came home to a marriage that was dead in everything but name, to a husband who barely acknowledged her presence, to a community that pitied her but could not help her. She came home to a house that did not feel like home, to a man who did not want her, and to a future that must have seemed impossibly bleak. She had been home for 5 days when she fell ill. At first, it seemed like nothing serious. A stomach complaint, nausea, weakness. Dr. Yeager, the family physician, was called. He examined her, asked questions, and diagnosed malaria. It was a common enough ailment in Indiana in the summer, when the heat and the humidity bred mosquitoes by the thousands. Rest, he said. Fluids. She would recover in a few days. But she did not recover. She got worse. The nausea became violent. She could not keep food down. She could not sleep. She complained of terrible pains in her stomach, pains that came in waves, that left her doubled over, gasping. Dr. Yeager came back. He was puzzled. The symptoms did not quite fit malaria, but he could not think what else it might be. He prescribed more rest, different medicines, and he told Pettit to keep a close eye on her. Pettit did not keep a close eye on her. He was hardly ever in the house, and when he was there, he seemed distant, distracted, almost annoyed by the inconvenience of his wife's illness. It was Clemmy Whitehead who came to nurse Hattie. Clemmy who sat by her bedside, who brought her water, who held the basin when she vomited. Clemmy, the woman who was sleeping with Hattie's husband, caring for her as she lay dying. The cruelty of it, the sheer audacity, is almost unbearable to contemplate. But Hattie trusted her. Hattie, sick and weak and desperate, trusted the woman who was helping to kill her. Because Hattie was being poisoned. Slowly, deliberately, methodically. The symptoms she was experiencing, the violent nausea, the convulsions, the agonizing pain, were the symptoms of strychnine poisoning. And someone was giving it to her, dose by dose, over the course of 5 days, watching her suffer, waiting for her to die. On the 3rd day of Hattie's illness, the convulsions began. They started in the evening, after she had tried to take a little broth that Clemmy had prepared for her. She complained that it tasted bitter, but she drank it anyway, because she was thirsty, because she wanted to believe she was getting better, because what choice did she have? Within an hour, her body went rigid. Her back arched. Her muscles contracted with such force that those who witnessed it said it looked as if she were being pulled apart from the inside. Her jaw locked. Her eyes rolled back. She could not speak, could not scream, could only make terrible choking sounds as her body betrayed her again and again. Dr. Yeager was called again. By now, even he was beginning to suspect that this was not malaria. But he did not say the word poison. Not yet. Perhaps he did not want to believe it. Perhaps he could not imagine that anyone in this house, this respectable Christian household, would do such a thing. Or perhaps he was simply afraid of the consequences of speaking such an accusation aloud. So he said he did not know what was wrong. He said he would consult with other physicians. He said they should pray. The convulsions subsided after a few hours, leaving Hattie exhausted, barely conscious. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. She drifted in and out of awareness, and when she was awake, she was confused, disoriented. She asked for William. She asked where he was, why he was not with her. The servants exchanged glances, but said nothing. What could they say? That he was downstairs, talking with Clemmy? That he seemed more concerned about his own reputation than his wife's suffering? That he had already begun to speak of her in the past tense, as if she were already gone? On the 4th day, Hattie rallied briefly. She was able to sit up, to take a little water. For a few hours, it seemed as if she might survive, as if whatever terrible thing had gripped her was loosening its hold. Dr. Yeager allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps it was some strange variant of malaria, something unusual but not sinister. Perhaps she would recover after all. But that evening, the convulsions returned, worse than before. This time, they lasted longer. This time, Hattie's body could not endure them. Her heart, already weakened by days of suffering, began to fail. Dr. Yeager knew she was dying. He could see it in the color of her skin, in the faintness of her pulse, in the way her breathing became more labored with each passing minute. He told Pettit to send for the family, to prepare for the worst. Pettit sent a telegram. He composed it carefully, choosing words that would convey the necessary information without revealing too much. He said Hattie was gravely ill. He said they should come if they could. He did not say what he suspected. He did not say what he knew. He simply sent the message and waited. Hattie died on July 17, 1889, just after midnight. She was 32 years old. The official cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Yeager, was malaria. But even as he wrote the words, he must have known they were a lie. He must have known that what he had witnessed was not the natural progression of disease, but something else, something deliberate. And yet he wrote malaria, because to write anything else would be to accuse someone of murder, and he was not ready to do that. Not yet. Perhaps he hoped he was wrong. Perhaps he hoped that the truth, whatever it was, would remain buried with Hattie. But the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. Pettit's behavior after Hattie's death was strange, even by the standards of grief. He did not weep. He did not collapse. He did not rage against God or fate or the cruelty of losing a young wife. He was calm, composed, almost businesslike. He made arrangements for the funeral with the efficiency of a man settling an account. He wanted it done quickly. He wanted the body embalmed immediately. He wanted Hattie buried in New York, far from Indiana, far from the people who might ask too many questions. The funeral was held at dawn, less than 12 hours after Hattie's death. It was a small service, hastily arranged, attended by only a handful of people. Pettit delivered a brief eulogy, speaking of Hattie's faith, her kindness, her devotion. He spoke as if he had loved her, as if her death was a tragedy that had befallen him rather than something he had orchestrated. And then it was over. The coffin was loaded onto a train bound for New York, and Hattie left Crawfordsville forever, sealed in a casket, embalmed so thoroughly that no one would think to question what had killed her. But people were already questioning. The servants had talked. Ollie Reese had told her friends what she had seen, what she had heard, and the story had spread. The neighbors had noticed the hurried funeral, the lack of public mourning, the way Pettit seemed almost relieved rather than grief-stricken. The ministers, men like Reverend Hickman who had known Hattie, who had heard her confessions, who had tried to help her, they remembered. They remembered the affair. They remembered Hattie's unhappiness. They remembered the way Pettit had dismissed their concerns, and now they wondered if they should have pushed harder, spoken louder, done more. And then there was George W. Switzer. Reverend Switzer was a Methodist preacher, a man of principle and stubbornness in equal measure. He had known Pettit for years, had served with him on church committees, had watched him rise through the ranks of the ministry. He had never liked him. There was something about Pettit that had always struck Switzer as false, as performative. The charm was too smooth. The humility was too calculated. The piety was too convenient. Switzer had kept his suspicions to himself, because suspicion was not proof, and because he believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. But when Hattie died, when he heard the circumstances of her death, when he learned of the hasty funeral and the immediate burial, his suspicions hardened into certainty. Switzer began to ask questions. He spoke to the servants. He spoke to the neighbors. He spoke to Dr. Yeager, who admitted, reluctantly, that he had doubts about the diagnosis of malaria. He spoke to other ministers who had known Hattie, who had heard her fears, who had failed to protect her. And the more Switzer learned, the more convinced he became that Hattie Pettit had been murdered, and that her husband and Clemmy Whitehead were responsible. But knowing something and proving it were two different things. Hattie was buried in New York. The body was embalmed. There was no evidence, no autopsy, no confession. All Switzer had were rumors, suspicions, the testimony of servants who could be dismissed as unreliable. He needed more. He needed something that could not be explained away, something that would force the authorities to act. So he waited. He watched. He kept notes. And he began writing letters. The letters were unsigned, but everyone knew who had written them. They were sent to newspapers, to church officials, to prominent citizens in Crawfordsville. They detailed the affair between Pettit and Clemmy Whitehead. They described Hattie's suffering, her complaints to ministers, her sudden and suspicious death. They asked why no one had investigated, why the body had been rushed out of state, why a man of God was being allowed to commit murder without consequence. The letters were inflammatory, accusatory, and impossible to ignore. The response was swift and divided. Some people were outraged at Switzer for spreading gossip, for attacking a grieving widower, for besmirching the reputation of a minister. Others were outraged at Pettit, at the thought that he might have killed his wife, at the realization that they had been deceived. The town split into factions. There were those who believed Pettit was innocent, who insisted that the affair had been exaggerated or fabricated, who demanded proof before they would condemn a man. And there were those who believed he was guilty, who pointed to the affair, the hasty funeral, the suspicious death, and said that where there was smoke, there was fire. Pettit fought back. He wrote letters of his own, defending his character, insisting on his innocence, accusing Switzer of malicious slander. He preached sermons about forgiveness, about the dangers of gossip, about the persecution of the righteous. He reminded people of his years of service, his reputation, his standing in the community. He said that he and Clemmy had been friends, nothing more, that their relationship had been misinterpreted by small minds and jealous hearts. He said that Hattie had died of malaria, that Dr. Yeager had said so, that there was no evidence of anything else. He said that he was being destroyed by lies, that his ministry was being ruined, that his very life was in danger from a mob whipped into frenzy by a vindictive man with a personal grudge. And for a while, it seemed as if he might succeed. Pettit was a persuasive man, a skilled orator, and he knew how to appeal to people's better angels, to their sense of fairness, to their reluctance to believe the worst without proof. He had allies, powerful allies, men in the church and the Masonic Lodge who owed him favors, who valued loyalty over truth. They rallied to his defense, wrote editorials in his support, pressured Switzer to stop his campaign. But Switzer would not stop. He could not. He had seen too much, heard too much, and he believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who knows he is right, that Hattie Pettit had been murdered and that justice had to be done. He went to the Methodist Conference, the body that governed the church in the region, and demanded an investigation. He presented his evidence, such as it was, the testimony of servants, the accounts of Hattie's suffering, the timeline of her death. He demanded that Pettit be questioned, that the affair be acknowledged, that the church take responsibility for the fact that one of its ministers had violated every vow he had ever made. The conference was uncomfortable. They did not want a scandal. They did not want the church dragged through the newspapers, its ministers accused of murder, its integrity questioned. But they could not ignore Switzer. He was too persistent, too credible, too well known. And so they agreed to hold a hearing, not a trial, but an inquiry, a chance for Pettit to defend himself and for the church to determine whether there was any basis for the accusations. The hearing was held in Battleground, Indiana, in late August. It was supposed to be private, but word had spread, and the hall was packed with ministers, laypeople, journalists. Everyone wanted to see how Pettit would respond, whether he would confess or deny, whether he would fight or flee. Pettit stood before the assembly and spoke for over an hour. He admitted, for the first time, that his relationship with Clemmy Whitehead had been inappropriate. He said that he had allowed their friendship to become too close, that he had been weak, that he had failed in his duties as a husband. But he insisted that the relationship had never been consummated, that it had been emotional but not physical, and that he had never, ever wished harm to his wife. He said that Hattie had died of malaria, that he had loved her, that her death had devastated him. He wept as he spoke, or seemed to weep, his voice breaking with emotion, his hands trembling. He begged for forgiveness, not for murder, but for the sin of neglecting his marriage, for allowing temptation to lead him astray. It was a masterful performance, and it was not enough. The ministers in the room had heard too much, seen too much. They did not believe him. They could not. And so, after hours of deliberation, they reached a decision. William F. Pettit was to be expelled from the Methodist ministry. He was no longer a preacher. He was no longer welcome in the pulpit. His credentials were revoked, his authority stripped away. He could appeal, if he wished, but the judgment was clear. He had failed as a minister, as a husband, as a man of God. Pettit left the hall in silence. He did not protest. He did not argue. He simply left, and for a few days, it seemed as if that would be the end of it. The church had acted. Pettit had been punished. Perhaps that would be enough. Perhaps justice, of a sort, had been done. But George Switzer was not satisfied. Expulsion from the ministry was not justice for murder. And Switzer believed, now more than ever, that Hattie had been murdered. He went to the prosecutor, to the sheriff, to anyone who would listen. He said that the body should be exhumed, that an autopsy should be performed, that the truth should be established once and for all. He said that if strychnine was found in Hattie's body, then there could be no more denials, no more excuses, no more delays. There would have to be an arrest, a trial, a reckoning. The authorities were reluctant. Exhumation was expensive, difficult, and often inconclusive. The body had been embalmed. Months had passed, and even if poison was found, proving who had administered it would be nearly impossible. But Switzer was relentless. He gathered affidavits from the servants, from the neighbors, from anyone who had seen or heard anything suspicious. He built a case, piece by piece, until finally, in the fall of 1889, the prosecutor agreed. An order was issued. Hattie Pettit's body was to be exhumed and examined. The exhumation took place in secret, in a cemetery in New York, far from the prying eyes of the press and the public. The coffin was opened. Tissue samples were taken, carefully preserved, and sent to a laboratory in Chicago, one of the few places in the country with the expertise to test for poisons. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The results came back in November. Strychnine. The laboratory had found strychnine in Hattie's liver, in her stomach, in quantities sufficient to cause death. There was no doubt. Hattie Pettit had not died of malaria. She had been poisoned. The news spread through Crawfordsville like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew. The whispers, the rumors, the suspicions that had swirled for months were confirmed. Hattie had been murdered. And now the question was not whether a crime had been committed, but who would be held accountable. The grand jury was convened in December. Witnesses were called. The servants testified. The doctors testified. George Switzer testified, laying out the timeline, the affair, the motive. The evidence was overwhelming, or so it seemed. And yet, when the grand jury delivered its findings, the result was shocking. They refused to indict William Pettit. They refused to indict Clemmy Whitehead. They said there was insufficient evidence to bring charges. The public outcry was immediate and furious. How could there be insufficient evidence? Strychnine had been found in the body. The affair was undeniable. The timeline was clear. What more did they need? But the grand jury stood by its decision, and the prosecutor, whether from cowardice or conviction, did not challenge it. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed as if Pettit and Clemmy would escape justice entirely. But Switzer, stubborn, relentless, would not let it end there. He went over the grand jury's head. He appealed directly to the Attorney General of Indiana, a man named Michener, who had a reputation for integrity and a willingness to take on difficult cases. Switzer presented the evidence again, argued the case again, and demanded that the state step in where the local authorities had failed. Michener reviewed the case. He interviewed witnesses. He consulted with experts. And in early 1890, he made his decision. The grand jury had been wrong. There was more than enough evidence to proceed. William F. Pettit and Clemmy Whitehead were to be arrested and charged with the murder of Hattie Pettit. The arrest of William Pettit took place in Ohio, where he had fled after the exhumation results became public. He did not resist. He did not protest his innocence. He simply surrendered, was brought back to Indiana in chains, and locked in the county jail to await trial. Clemmy Whitehead was arrested a few days later, at her home in Shawnee Mount. She was calm, dignified, and utterly silent. She refused to answer questions, refused to make a statement, refused to cooperate in any way. She was released on bail. A privilege Pettit was not granted, and she returned to her home to wait. The trial was set for the spring of 1890. It would be held in Crawfordsville, in the same courthouse where so many other cases had been decided, but this one was different. This one mattered. This one would determine not just the fate of two individuals, but the soul of the community itself. Because if Pettit and Clemmy were guilty, if a preacher and a respected widow could murder a woman in cold blood and nearly get away with it, then what did that say about the town, about the church, about the institutions everyone had trusted? The trial would answer that question, or at least it would try. The months between the arrest and the trial were strange, unsettled. Crawfordsville was a town divided, and the division ran deeper than anyone had expected. There were families who stopped speaking to each other because one side believed Pettit was guilty and the other insisted he was innocent. There were churches where congregations split over whether to pray for his conviction or his acquittal. There were Masonic lodges where men who had once called each other brother now refused to sit in the same room. The case had become more than a legal matter. It had become a test of belief, of loyalty, of what people were willing to accept about the world they lived in. For some, Pettit's guilt was obvious. They looked at the evidence and saw a man who had betrayed every trust, who had used his position as a minister to seduce a wealthy widow, who had poisoned his wife when she became inconvenient. They saw a man who had lied, manipulated, and performed righteousness while committing murder. They wanted him punished, not just for Hattie's sake, but for the sake of justice itself, for the principle that no one, not even a preacher, was above the law. For others, the idea that Pettit could be guilty was unthinkable. They had known him for years. They had listened to his sermons, trusted him with their confessions, welcomed him into their homes. To accept that he was a murderer was to accept that they had been deceived, that their judgment had been wrong, that the institutions they relied on, the church, the lodge, the bonds of community, had failed them. It was easier to believe that Pettit was innocent, that he had been framed, that the evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted. It was easier to believe that George Switzer was a fanatic, a troublemaker, a man with a personal vendetta who had ruined a good man's life. And there were those, perhaps the largest group, who simply did not know what to believe. They looked at the evidence and saw reasonable doubt. They looked at Pettit and saw a man who had made mistakes, who had been weak, who had sinned, but who might not be a killer. They wanted the trial to settle the matter, to give them clarity, to tell them what to think. William Pettit sat in jail through the winter, and the conditions were not kind. The cell was cold, damp, poorly ventilated. He was allowed visitors, but not many came. Some of his former friends in the Masonic Lodge sent letters of support, but they did not visit. They did not want to be seen associating with him, not while the outcome was still uncertain. His family, what little he had, stayed away. He was alone, more alone than he had ever been. And for a man who had built his entire life on the approval and admiration of others, the isolation must have been unbearable. Clemmy, by contrast, remained free. She lived in the Mahari house, surrounded by her wealth, her land, her reputation. She did not speak to the press. She did not attend church. She did not appear in public unless absolutely necessary. She simply waited, silent and inscrutable, and the town speculated endlessly about what she was thinking, what she was feeling, whether she felt any guilt at all. The trial began on April 14, 1890. The courthouse was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and those who could not get inside crowded around the doors and windows, straining to hear. Journalists from across the state were there, taking notes, sending dispatches by telegraph. Even Lew Wallace, the famous author of Ben-Hur and a former governor of Indiana, attended some of the sessions, curious to see how the drama would unfold. It was the trial of the decade, and everyone knew it. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General himself, Michener, a shrewd and methodical man who had built his case carefully. His strategy was simple: establish motive, establish opportunity, establish means. Show that Pettit and Clemmy had been having an affair. Show that Hattie's death benefited them. Show that strychnine had been present in the household, that Pettit had access to it, and that the symptoms Hattie exhibited were consistent with poisoning. Make it impossible for the jury to believe that her death was anything other than murder. Michener opened with the affair. He called witness after witness who testified to seeing Pettit and Clemmy together, in the buggy, at revival meetings, at the Mahari house. He called Ollie Reese, the servant, who described in careful detail what she had seen and heard. The embraces, the conversations about marriage, the way Pettit had moved into the house when Hattie was away. He called other servants who confirmed Ollie's testimony, who said that Pettit and Clemmy had behaved as if they were already husband and wife, long before Hattie died. The defense objected repeatedly. They said the affair, even if it had occurred, did not prove murder. They said that people had affairs all the time without resorting to poison. They said that the prosecution was trying to prejudice the jury by painting Pettit as an adulterer, which was irrelevant to the question of whether he had killed his wife. But the judge, somewhat surprisingly, allowed most of the testimony. He seemed to understand that motive mattered, that the jury needed to see why Pettit might have wanted Hattie dead. Next, Michener called the doctors. Dr. Yeager took the stand and admitted, reluctantly, that he had diagnosed malaria but had never been certain. He described Hattie's symptoms, the convulsions, the vomiting, the pain, and he acknowledged that they were consistent with strychnine poisoning. He admitted that he had been troubled by the case, that he had suspected something was wrong, but that he had not known what to do. His testimony was damaging, not because it proved Pettit's guilt, but because it destroyed the defense's claim that Hattie had died of natural causes. Then came the toxicologist from the Chicago laboratory, a man named Haynes, who explained how he had tested the tissue samples from Hattie's body. He described the chemical processes he had used, the controls he had implemented, the certainty with which he could say that strychnine had been present. He said that the amount found was more than enough to cause death, that it could not have been accidental, that someone had deliberately administered a lethal dose. His testimony was dry, technical, but it was devastating. There was no longer any question about how Hattie had died. She had been poisoned. Michener then turned to the question of who had access to strychnine. He produced evidence that Pettit had attempted to purchase strychnine from a local pharmacist a few weeks before Hattie's death. The pharmacist, a man named Milligan, testified that Pettit had come into his shop and asked for strychnine, saying he needed it to kill rats. Milligan had refused to sell it to him without a witness, as the law required, and Pettit had left without the poison. But the attempt was enough to show that Pettit had been thinking about strychnine, that he had wanted it, that he had tried to obtain it. The defense argued that the attempt to purchase proved nothing. They said that Pettit had not actually bought strychnine, that he had complied with the law when told he needed a witness, and that there was no evidence he had obtained it from another source. But the damage was done. The jury had heard that Pettit had tried to buy the very poison that killed his wife, and no amount of legal argument could erase that fact from their minds. Michener also introduced testimony about a dog that had died on the Pettit property a few weeks before Hattie's death. The dog had exhibited symptoms similar to Hattie's, convulsions, vomiting, and had died within hours. Neighbors testified that they had seen Pettit dispose of the body quickly, without explanation. The implication was clear. Pettit had tested the poison on the dog to see how it worked, to determine the correct dosage, to make sure it would kill. The defense objected vehemently. They said the dog's death was irrelevant, that there was no proof it had been poisoned, that it could have died of any number of causes. But again, the judge allowed the testimony, and again, the jury listened, and the picture Michener was painting became clearer and more damning with each witness. Finally, Michener called witnesses to describe the days leading up to Hattie's death. He established a timeline. Hattie returned from New York on July 12th. She was healthy, or at least not seriously ill, when she arrived. By July 13th, she was complaining of nausea. By July 14th, she was bedridden. By July 15th, she was convulsing. By July 17th, she was dead. 5 days. And during those 5 days, Pettit had been in the house. Clemmy had been in the house. Both of them had access to Hattie's food, her water, her medicine. Both of them had opportunity. Michener did not claim to know exactly when the poison had been administered or by whom. He did not need to. He simply needed to show that it had been possible, that the two people with the strongest motive had also had the means and the opportunity. He needed to show that Hattie's death was not an accident, not a tragedy, but a crime. And then it was the defense's turn. The defense strategy was to attack the credibility of the witnesses, to create reasonable doubt, and to suggest, without quite saying it outright, that there was a conspiracy against Pettit. They called character witnesses who testified that Pettit had been a good minister, a kind man, someone who would never harm anyone. They called medical experts who questioned the reliability of the toxicology tests, who said that embalming fluid could produce false positives, that the presence of strychnine did not necessarily mean it had been the cause of death. They called neighbors who said they had never seen anything improper between Pettit and Clemmy, who insisted that the rumors of an affair had been exaggerated. But the defense faced a fundamental problem. They could not explain away the strychnine. They could argue about how it got there, about whether the tests were accurate, about whether it had really killed Hattie. But they could not make it disappear. And as long as the jury believed the strychnine was real, as long as they believed Hattie had been poisoned, the defense was fighting an uphill battle. The defense also tried to introduce evidence of a conspiracy. They suggested that George Switzer had orchestrated the entire case out of personal animosity toward Pettit. They suggested that the servants had been coached, that their testimony had been fabricated, that the whole thing was a vendetta disguised as justice. But they could not produce any proof. They could not show why Switzer would want to destroy Pettit, what he had to gain, why he would risk his own reputation on a lie. And without proof, the conspiracy theory sounded like desperation. Pettit himself did not testify. His lawyers advised against it, and he followed their advice. In the 19th century, defendants were not required to take the stand, and often did not, because cross-examination could be brutal and unforgiving. But his silence was noted. The jury saw a man who would not defend himself, who would not look them in the eye and deny the charges, and they drew their own conclusions. Clemmy Whitehead was not on trial. The prosecution had decided to try Pettit first, to see if they could get a conviction, and then decide whether to proceed against her. She sat in the courtroom every day, dressed in black, her face expressionless, watching the proceedings without comment. Occasionally, she and Pettit exchanged glances, but they did not speak. They could not afford to be seen communicating, to give the jury any more reason to believe they were co-conspirators. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The closing arguments were impassioned, almost theatrical. Michener spoke for hours, walking the jury through the evidence step by step, building the case piece by piece, until the conclusion seemed inescapable. He said that Hattie Pettit had been a good woman, a faithful wife, who had died in agony because her husband wanted her gone. He said that Pettit had used his position as a minister to deceive, to seduce, to kill. He said that if the jury did not convict, if they allowed Pettit to walk free, then they were saying that ministers were above the law, that the powerful could murder the weak without consequence. He said that justice, true justice, required a guilty verdict. The defense countered with their own impassioned plea. They said that the prosecution had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. They said that the presence of strychnine was not enough, that without direct evidence of who administered it, or when, or how, the jury could not convict. They said that Pettit was a flawed man, a man who had made mistakes, but that mistakes were not murder. They said that the jury was being asked to convict based on gossip, on suspicion, on the word of servants and enemies, and that such a conviction would be a miscarriage of justice. And then the case went to the jury. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In the courthouse, in the streets, in homes and churches across Crawfordsville, people waited. They speculated about what the jury was thinking, about whether they would convict or acquit, about what it would mean either way. The tension was unbearable. Fights broke out in saloons between those who believed Pettit was guilty and those who insisted he was innocent. Preachers delivered sermons about justice and mercy, about the dangers of rushing to judgment, about the need to trust in the legal system even when the outcome was uncertain. Inside the jury room, the deliberations were heated. Some jurors believed Pettit was guilty from the start, and nothing the defense said could change their minds. Others were uncertain, troubled by the lack of direct evidence, by the fact that no one had actually seen Pettit administer the poison. They argued, debated, reviewed the testimony over and over. They took votes, changed their minds, took votes again. On the second day, they reached a verdict. Word spread through the courthouse like lightning. The courtroom filled within minutes. People pushed and shoved to get inside, to see the moment, to hear the words that would decide William Pettit's fate. The jury filed in, their faces somber. The judge called for order. The foreman stood. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just heard. Pettit himself did not react. He sat perfectly still, his face blank, as if he had expected this, as if he had known all along that it would end this way. His lawyers put their hands on his shoulders, whispered something to him, but he did not respond. The judge asked if there was anything the defendant wished to say before sentencing. Pettit stood. For a moment, it seemed as if he might confess, might finally tell the truth about what had happened. But he did not. He said only that he was innocent, that he had been wrongly convicted, that he prayed God would forgive those who had borne false witness against him. And then he sat down. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. In Indiana, At that time, life meant life. There was no parole, no possibility of early release. Pettit would spend the rest of his days behind bars, and he would die there. He was taken from the courtroom in chains, led through a crowd that parted to let him pass. Some people jeered. Some prayed. Some simply stared, trying to reconcile the man they had trusted with the man who had just been convicted of murder. Pettit did not look at them. He kept his eyes straight ahead, and he did not speak. Clemmy Whitehead left the courtroom quietly, surrounded by family. She had not been charged, not yet, but everyone knew that the prosecution was considering it. They were waiting to see if Pettit would confess, would implicate her, would give them the evidence they needed to bring her to trial. But Pettit did not confess. He maintained his innocence, insisted that Hattie had died of malaria, that the strychnine had been a mistake or a fabrication. And without his testimony, without some new piece of evidence, the case against Clemmy was weak, circumstantial, difficult to prove. Weeks passed. The prosecutors debated. They knew Clemmy was guilty, or at least they believed she was. They believed she had helped Pettit, that she had been at the very least an accomplice, and perhaps more than that. Perhaps she had been the one who administered the poison. Perhaps she had been the one who planned it. But belief was not proof, and they were not certain they could get a conviction. In the end, they decided not to prosecute. They told themselves it was because the evidence was insufficient, but there were other reasons too. Clemmy was wealthy. She had powerful friends. She could afford the best lawyers, could drag the trial out for years, could make it expensive and politically damaging. And she was a woman, and juries in the 19th century were reluctant to convict women of murder, especially women of standing and respectability. The prosecutors knew that even if they brought her to trial, even if they presented the same evidence that had convicted Pettit, there was a very real chance she would be acquitted. And an acquittal would be worse than no trial at all. It would be a vindication, a declaration that she was innocent, and that was a risk they were not willing to take. So Clemmy Whitehead was never charged. She was never tried. She was never formally held accountable for what had happened to Hattie Pettit. She lived out the rest of her life in Shawnee Mound, in the house that had once belonged to David Mahari, surrounded by her wealth and her silence. She never spoke publicly about the case. She never admitted guilt. She never expressed remorse. She simply went on, as if nothing had happened, as if Hattie had never existed. But she did not go on unchanged. The trial had destroyed her reputation. She was no longer welcome in church, no longer invited to social gatherings, no longer treated with the respect she had once commanded. People crossed the street to avoid her. Children were warned to stay away from her property. She became a pariah, a figure of disgust and fear, and she lived the rest of her life alone, isolated, shunned by the very community that had once admired her. Some people thought that was justice enough. They said that Clemmy was suffering, that her punishment was social rather than legal, but no less real for that. They said that she would carry the guilt of what she had done for the rest of her life, that she would never be free of it, and that perhaps that was worse than prison. Others thought it was a travesty. They thought Clemmy had gotten away with murder, that she had used her wealth and her gender to escape the consequences of her actions, and that the law had failed Hattie twice. Once by not protecting her while she was alive, and again by not punishing the woman who had helped kill her. George Switzer was satisfied, but only partially. He had fought for years to see Pettit brought to justice, and he had succeeded. But he had wanted more. He had wanted Clemmy convicted as well. He had wanted both of them punished, both of them held accountable. Still, he took what he could get. He had done what he set out to do. He had proven that Hattie had been murdered. He had forced the authorities to act. He had ensured that at least one person paid the price. And if that was not perfect justice, it was better than nothing. William Pettit was sent to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, a grim, forbidding place on the shore of Lake Michigan. It was a hard prison, a place where men worked long hours in the quarry or the workshop, where discipline was harsh, and where mercy was scarce. Pettit was assigned to the workshop, where he made brooms and chairs, repetitive labor that left his hands raw and his mind numb. He did not adjust well to prison life. He was not a strong man physically, and the work exhausted him. He was not a sociable man, and he made few friends among the other inmates. He kept to himself, spoke little, and spent his evenings reading the Bible in his cell, perhaps seeking forgiveness, perhaps seeking some way to make sense of what had happened to him. He maintained his innocence. He wrote letters to friends, to former colleagues in the ministry, to anyone who might listen, insisting that he had been wrongly convicted, that he was a victim of conspiracy and prejudice. Some people believed him. Some people wrote back, offering sympathy and support. But most people had moved on. The trial was over. Pettit was in prison. Hattie was dead, and the world had other concerns. Pettit's health declined rapidly. The prison was damp and cold, and the conditions aggravated a lung condition he had developed. He began coughing, first occasionally, then constantly. He lost weight. His strength failed. The prison doctor diagnosed tuberculosis, a death sentence in the 19th century, and there was nothing to be done but wait. Pettit's lawyers filed an appeal. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that the judge had allowed too much prejudicial testimony, that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than evidence. They asked for a new trial, or at least a reduction in sentence. The appeal made its way slowly through the courts, and for a while, Pettit allowed himself to hope. He thought that perhaps he would be freed, that he would be vindicated, that he would be able to start over somewhere far from Indiana, somewhere no one knew his name. But the appeal was denied. The court ruled that the trial had been fair, that the evidence had been sufficient, and that the conviction would stand. Pettit received the news in his cell, alone, and whatever hope he had been clinging to died with it. He lasted a few more months. The tuberculosis consumed him slowly, painfully. He grew weaker, thinner, until he could barely stand. He stopped eating. He stopped writing letters. He simply lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the end. William F. Pettit died on November 3, 1891, less than 2 years after his conviction. He was 36 years old. The official cause of death was tuberculosis, but in a deeper sense, he died of his own choices, of the lies he had told, of the trust he had betrayed, of the life he had taken. He was buried in the prison cemetery, in an unmarked grave, and no one came to mourn him. Back in Crawfordsville, the news of Pettit's death was met with mixed reactions. Some people said it was justice, that he had gotten what he deserved, that God had punished him even if the law had not been able to execute him. Others said it was tragic, that he had died before he could prove his innocence, before he could clear his name. And some people said nothing at all, because they had already forgotten him, because the scandal was old news, because life had moved on. Hattie Pettit was buried in New York, far from Indiana, in a quiet cemetery where no one visited her grave. She had no children to remember her, no close family to keep her memory alive. She was simply gone, erased from the world as if she had never been. And only a few people like George Switzer, people who had known her, who had heard her voice, who had seen her suffer, remembered that she had ever existed. Clemmy Whitehead lived for many more years. She never remarried. She never left Shawnee Mount. She managed her land, paid her taxes, and kept to herself. She grew old alone, and when she died, sometime in the early 20th century, her death was barely noticed. There was no grand funeral, no obituary in the newspaper, no public acknowledgement of her passing. She simply disappeared from the record, as Hattie had, and the world moved on. The Methodist Church tried to forget the scandal. They did not speak of Pettit, did not mention his name in their histories, did not acknowledge that one of their ministers had been convicted of murder. They wanted to put it behind them, to move forward, to rebuild their reputation. And for the most part, they succeeded. Within a generation, the Pettit case was a footnote, a story older people told to warn younger people about the dangers of trusting too easily. But the case did leave a mark. It changed the way people thought about ministers, about the assumption that a man of God was necessarily a good man. It made them more skeptical, more willing to question, more aware that appearances could be deceiving. And it raised questions that have never been fully answered, about justice, about power, about what happens when the institutions we trust fail us. Was justice served? In one sense, yes. Pettit was convicted. He spent the rest of his life in prison. He paid, if not with his life in the legal sense, then with his freedom, his health, his very existence. But in another sense, justice was incomplete. Clemmy Whitehead was never punished. She lived out her life in comfort, if not in happiness, and she never faced a jury, never had to answer for what she had done. And Hattie got nothing. No vindication, no peace, just death, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, people would remember that she had mattered, that her life had meant something. The question that haunts the case, that has haunted it from the beginning, is this: who really killed Hattie Pettit? Was it William, acting alone, driven by lust and greed and the desire to be free? Was it Clemmy, the woman with the most to gain, the woman who nursed Hattie through her final days, who had the opportunity, the means, the motive? Or was it both of them, working together, conspirators in the truest sense, bound by their affair and their guilt? We will never know for certain. Pettit never confessed. Clemmy never spoke. The evidence points to both of them, but it does not tell us who poured the poison into Hattie's cup, who watched her drink it, who stood by as she died in agony. It tells us that she was murdered, and it tells us who benefited, but it does not give us the one thing we most want: certainty. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the story. Not just that a woman was murdered, but that the full truth, the complete story of what happened in that house in July of 1889, will never be known. We can reconstruct the events, follow the evidence, draw our conclusions, but we cannot see into the hearts of the people involved. We cannot know what they were thinking, what they were feeling, what they told themselves to justify what they had done. All we can do is remember. Remember Hattie, who deserved better than the life she was given, better than the death she suffered. Remember the people who fought for her, who refused to let her murder be forgotten, who demanded justice even when it seemed impossible. And remember the lesson, if there is one, that trust is a precious thing, and that it must be earned, not assumed, and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who betray us most completely. The years after the trial brought changes to Crawfordsville, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The town that had once been so certain of itself, so confident in its institutions and its leaders, had been shaken. People were more cautious now, more skeptical. They looked at their ministers differently, wondered what private lives might lurk behind public piety. They questioned their own judgment, asked themselves how they could have been so easily deceived. Some became more devout, as if trying to reclaim the faith that had been tainted by scandal. Others drifted away from the church entirely, disillusioned by the revelation that evil could wear a clerical collar and speak in the language of salvation. The Masonic Lodge faced its own reckoning. Many members had supported Pettit throughout the trial, had vouched for his character, had insisted that a brother Mason could not possibly be a murderer. When the guilty verdict came down, they were forced to confront the fact that they had been wrong, that their loyalty had been misplaced, that their fraternity had been used as a shield by a man who understood how to exploit trust. Some members left the lodge in disgust. Others stayed but demanded reforms, insisted that character had to be judged by actions rather than words, that membership had to mean more than secret handshakes and ritual performances. The press, local and statewide, eventually moved on to other scandals, other crimes, other stories. But for years afterward, whenever a similar case arose, whenever a minister was accused of wrongdoing, whenever a respected figure fell from grace, someone would invoke the name Pettit. It became a cautionary tale, a reference point, a reminder that evil could hide in plain sight. George Switzer never stopped talking about the case. He gave lectures, wrote articles, corresponded with anyone interested in the details. He saw himself as a crusader for justice, and in many ways, he was. Without his persistence, without his refusal to let the matter rest, Hattie's murder might never have been investigated, much less prosecuted. But Switzer was also human, and like all humans, he had his flaws. He could be self-righteous, uncompromising, unwilling to see nuance or complexity. He believed absolutely in his own version of events, and anyone who questioned him was, in his mind, complicit in the cover-up. Still, history has been kind to Switzer. Most accounts of the case treat him as a hero, the man who stood up when others remained silent, who fought for a victim who could not fight for herself. And that assessment is largely fair. Switzer did what needed to be done, even when it cost him friendships, even when it made him unpopular, even when it would have been easier to let the matter drop. He understood that justice sometimes requires stubbornness, that righteousness sometimes demands discomfort, and he was willing to pay that price. Hattie's family in New York learned of the trial results through letters and newspaper reports. They were relieved that Pettit had been convicted, grateful that someone had been held accountable. But their relief was tempered by grief, by the knowledge that no verdict could bring Hattie back, could undo the suffering she had endured in her final days. They visited her grave when they could, brought flowers, said prayers, and tried to find comfort in the belief that she was at peace now, that her suffering was over, that she was in a better place. But they also carried anger. Anger at Pettit, certainly, but also at the system that had failed her while she was alive. Hattie had tried to get help. She had confided in ministers, had told them she was unhappy, had asked for intervention. And what had they done? They had counseled patience. They had told her to pray, to submit, to wait for God to change her husband's heart. They had treated her suffering as a private matter, a domestic concern, something to be endured rather than addressed. And so she had endured, until she could endure no longer, until someone decided she was too inconvenient to live. The question of what could have been done differently haunted many people. Could Reverend Hickman have done more? Could the church have intervened earlier? Could someone, anyone, have seen what was coming and stopped it? The answers were elusive, complicated. Divorce was not a realistic option for Hattie. She had no independent means, no place to go. The law offered little protection to women in her situation. Even if she had left, even if she had somehow managed to support herself, the social stigma would have been crushing. She would have been seen as a failure, a woman who could not keep her husband, who had abandoned her sacred duties. So she had stayed, and staying had killed her. The case raised uncomfortable questions about marriage, about the power dynamics between men and women, about the way society prioritized the preservation of marriage over the safety and happiness of wives. These were not questions most people wanted to think about, not in the 1890s, not in a culture that still believed deeply in the sanctity of the home and the authority of the husband. But the questions lingered, spoken quietly in women's circles, whispered among those who had seen too much, who knew too many Hatties, who understood that the Pettit case was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger problem. The legal system, for its part, had functioned, more or less as intended. A crime had been committed. Evidence had been gathered. A trial had been held. A verdict had been reached. Justice, in the formal sense, had been done. But the law is a blunt instrument, capable of punishment, but not of healing, of retribution, but not of prevention. It could lock Pettit away, but it could not undo the years of manipulation, the months of suffering, the moment of death. It could not give Hattie back her life, her future, her chance at happiness. And it could not touch Clemmy Whitehead. Clemmy's escape from prosecution remained a source of bitterness for many. She had been there. She had participated. She had benefited. And yet she faced no trial, no jury, no reckoning. The reasons for this were pragmatic, legal, political. But to those who believed in justice, who believed that all guilty parties should be held accountable, the decision not to prosecute felt like a betrayal. Some people took matters into their own hands, in small, petty ways. They refused to do business with Clemmy. They shunned her in public. They made sure she knew she was not welcome, not forgiven, not forgotten. It was a kind of justice, informal and communal, the judgment of neighbors rather than the judgment of law. But it was also cruel, relentless, and it lasted for the rest of her life. Clemmy bore it without complaint, at least publicly. She did not defend herself, did not try to win back the community's favor. She simply withdrew, became more reclusive, more isolated. She hired people to manage her land, to handle her business affairs, to interact with the world on her behalf. She stayed inside her house, behind closed doors, and let the years pass. What she thought about during those years, we can only imagine. Did she feel guilt? Did she regret what had happened? Did she think about Hattie, about the woman she had helped destroy? Or did she rationalize, justify, tell herself that she had done nothing wrong, that she had simply fallen in love with the wrong man at the wrong time, that events had spiraled beyond her control? We do not know. We cannot know. Clemmy left no diary, no letters, no confession. She took her secrets to the grave, and they remain there still. The broader implications of the case extended beyond Crawfordsville. The trial had been covered extensively in the press, and it became a national story, albeit briefly. Newspapers across the country reported on the preacher who poisoned his wife, the widow who escaped justice, the small town torn apart by scandal. Editorials debated the morality of the death penalty, the reliability of toxicology, the role of the church in regulating the behavior of its ministers. The case became a reference point in legal textbooks, used to illustrate principles of evidence, motive, and reasonable doubt. But for all the attention it received, the case did not lead to any significant reforms. No laws were changed. No new protections were put in place for women in Hattie's position. The legal system continued to operate as it always had, sometimes delivering justice, sometimes failing to, depending on the circumstances, the evidence, the skill of the lawyers, the temperament of the jury. The church, too, continued largely unchanged. Ministers were still trusted, still revered, still given the benefit of the doubt. Scandals occurred, were dealt with quietly or not at all, and then were forgotten. The Pettit case was an anomaly, a moment when the facade cracked and the truth was revealed, but it did not fundamentally alter the way the church operated or the way congregations related to their leaders. In Shawnee Mound, life went on. Farmers planted and harvested. Children were born, grew up, married, had children of their own. The Mahari house stood empty for a time after Clemmy's death, then was sold, divided, repurposed. The church where Pettit had preached was torn down eventually, replaced by a newer building. The gravestones in the cemetery weathered and faded, names becoming harder to read, stories being forgotten. But some people remembered. Older residents would tell the story to younger ones, usually in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might summon the ghosts of that terrible summer. They would point out the locations, the house where Hattie died, the church where Pettit preached, the road where he and Clemmy had driven together in the evenings. They would talk about who had believed in Pettit's guilt and who had defended him, who had been right and who had been wrong. And they would shake their heads, marveling at how such a thing could have happened, how no one had stopped it, how close the truth had come to being buried forever. The story became part of the town's identity, a dark chapter that could not be erased, a reminder that evil was not something that happened elsewhere, to other people, but something that could emerge in any community, from any person, given the right circumstances. It was a humbling realization, and an important one. For those interested in true crime, in the history of murder and justice, the Pettit case offers a wealth of material. It has all the elements of a classic crime story: motive, means, opportunity, betrayal, sex, religion, power. It has a victim who deserves sympathy, a villain who inspires outrage, and a complex supporting cast of witnesses, investigators, and bystanders. It has courtroom drama, forensic science in its infancy, and the spectacle of a community grappling with its own complicity. But it is also more than that. It is a story about how we construct trust, how we decide who to believe, how we balance skepticism with faith. It is a story about institutions, about the church and the law and the community, and about what happens when those institutions fail to protect the vulnerable. It is a story about gender, about the limited options available to women in the 19th century, about the ways marriage could trap and destroy. And it is a story about memory, about how we choose to remember or forget, about which stories we tell and which we allow to fade into silence. Hattie Pettit deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, though she was that, but as a person, a woman with hopes and dreams and intelligence and kindness. A woman who tried to make her marriage work, who sought help when she needed it, who trusted the people around her to do the right thing. A woman who was failed by nearly everyone who should have protected her, and who paid for that failure with her life. William Pettit, too, deserves to be remembered, though not with sympathy. He was a man who understood the power of performance, who knew how to use faith and fellowship to manipulate and deceive. He was a man who wanted what he wanted and was willing to lie, to cheat, to kill to get it. He was charming and intelligent and utterly without conscience. And he represents a type of predator that still exists, that will always exist, as long as there are people willing to trust without verification, to believe without proof. Clemmy Whitehead is perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the story. Was she a co-conspirator, actively planning and executing Hattie's murder? Or was she a passive participant, complicit but not directly responsible? Did she administer the poison herself, or did she simply stand by while Pettit did it, offering encouragement, providing cover, benefiting from the outcome? We cannot say for certain. What we know is that she was there, that she had motive, that she had opportunity, and that she escaped justice. Whether that escape was fair or not, whether it was a failure of the legal system or a recognition of insufficient evidence, remains a matter of debate. And George Switzer, the man who refused to let the case die, who pushed and prodded and insisted until the truth could no longer be denied, he too deserves recognition. Not as a perfect man, not as someone without flaws, but as someone who understood that justice sometimes requires courage, that standing up for what is right is not always easy or popular, and that silence in the face of evil is itself a form of complicity. The Pettit case is not unique. Variations of it have played out countless times, in countless places, across centuries. A person in a position of trust betrays that trust. A vulnerable person is harmed or killed. The community is shocked, outraged, divided. The legal system struggles to respond. Some measure of justice is achieved, or it is not. And then life goes on, and the story becomes history, and eventually, if we are not careful, it is forgotten. But we should not forget. We should remember these stories, not because they are entertaining, though they can be, but because they teach us. They teach us about human nature, about the capacity for good and for evil that exists in all of us. They teach us about the importance of skepticism, of questioning authority, of not assuming that someone is virtuous simply because they claim to be. They teach us about the fragility of justice, about how easily it can be thwarted by power, by money, by social status. And they teach us about the importance of bearing witness, of speaking up, of refusing to let crimes be swept under the rug. In the decades that followed, as the 20th century dawned and Indiana transformed from a rural, agricultural state into a more industrial and urban one, the Pettit case gradually faded from public consciousness. New scandals emerged. New crimes captured the public's attention. The people who had lived through the events, who had attended the trial, who had known Hattie and Pettit and Clemmy personally, grew old and died, taking their memories with them. But the case was not entirely forgotten. Historians and criminologists occasionally revisited it, drawn by its dramatic elements and the questions it raised about justice and institutional failure. Local historians in Montgomery County, where Crawfordsville is located, preserved documents related to the case, trial transcripts, newspaper clippings, letters, photographs. These materials provide a window into a specific moment in time, a moment when a community confronted evil and had to decide how to respond. The trial transcript, in particular, is a valuable resource. It runs to hundreds of pages, documenting every question asked, every answer given, every objection raised. Reading it today, more than a century later, one is struck by how familiar it all seems. The legal strategies, the rhetorical flourishes, the attempts to manipulate the jury's emotions, these are timeless elements of criminal trials. The specific details have changed, forensic science has advanced, legal procedures have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. What stands out most in the transcript is the testimony of the servants, particularly Ollie Reese. Her account of what she saw and heard in the Mahari house is detailed, consistent, and deeply damning. She described seeing Pettit and Clemmy embrace, hearing them discuss marriage, watching them behave as if they were already a couple. She described the way Clemmy nursed Hattie, bringing her food and drink, sitting by her bedside. She described Pettit's coldness toward his dying wife, his absence from the house for long stretches, his apparent lack of concern. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to discredit Ollie. They suggested she was lying, that she had been coached by the prosecution, that she had a grudge against Pettit or Clemmy. But Ollie held firm. She answered every question calmly, clearly, without hesitation. She did not embellish. She did not speculate. She simply told what she had seen, and her credibility was evident to everyone in the courtroom. The defense also tried to suggest that Ollie, as a servant, as someone of lower social status, could not be trusted to accurately interpret what she had witnessed. This was a common tactic in the 19th century, an appeal to class prejudice, an assumption that the word of a wealthy, respectable person should carry more weight than the word of a poor one. But the jury did not seem swayed by this argument. They understood that servants often saw and heard things that their employers wanted to keep hidden, and that Ollie had no reason to lie. The medical testimony was also crucial. Dr. Yeager's admission that he had misdiagnosed Hattie's illness was painful to hear. He was an experienced physician, respected in the community, and yet he had failed to recognize the signs of poisoning. Why? Partly because he did not suspect it, did not imagine that anyone would do such a thing. Partly because he wanted to believe the best of Pettit, wanted to trust that a minister would not harm his wife. And partly because the symptoms of strychnine poisoning, especially in the early stages, can mimic other illnesses. But once the convulsions began, once Hattie's body started to contort in agony, Yeager should have known. He should have questioned the diagnosis, should have consulted with other doctors, should have considered the possibility of poisoning. His failure to do so allowed Hattie to suffer for days, allowed the poisoning to continue, allowed her killers to believe they might get away with it. Yeager's testimony at the trial was tinged with regret. He admitted his mistakes, acknowledged that he should have acted differently. But his regrets could not bring Hattie back, could not undo the suffering she had endured. All they could do was serve as a cautionary tale for other physicians, a reminder that trust must be balanced with vigilance, that even the most respectable people are capable of terrible acts. The toxicologist's testimony was more straightforward. He explained the science behind the detection of strychnine, the chemical tests he had performed, the controls he had used to ensure accuracy. He acknowledged that embalming fluid could potentially interfere with the tests, but he had accounted for that, had used methods that minimized the risk of false positives. He was confident, based on his analysis, that Hattie had ingested a lethal dose of strychnine, and that it had been the cause of her death. The defense challenged this testimony vigorously. They brought in their own expert, a chemist who testified that the tests were unreliable, that the results could have been contaminated, that the presence of strychnine did not necessarily mean it had been administered deliberately. But the prosecution's expert was more credible, more experienced, and more convincing. The jury believed him, and that belief was central to their verdict. The question of where the strychnine came from was never fully resolved. The pharmacist testified that Pettit had tried to buy it, but had been turned away. So where did he get it? One theory was that he had obtained it from another source, perhaps a less scrupulous pharmacist in a neighboring town, or perhaps from a veterinarian, who would have had access to poisons for treating livestock. Another theory was that Clemmy had obtained it, either before or after David Mahari's death, and had kept it on hand for some purpose. The prosecution did not need to prove exactly where the strychnine came from. They only needed to prove that it had been administered, that Pettit and Clemmy had motive and opportunity, and that the death was not natural. The jury accepted this argument and convicted Pettit based on the totality of the evidence. One aspect of the case that is often overlooked is the role of the press. Newspapers in the 19th century were partisan, sensational, and often unreliable. They did not adhere to the standards of objectivity that modern journalism, at its best, strives for. They took sides, editorialized freely, and sometimes printed rumors as facts. In the Pettit case, the press was instrumental in keeping the story alive. They reported on the affair, the death, the suspicions. They published letters from George Switzer and responses from Pettit. They covered the trial in exhaustive detail, printing transcripts of testimony, sketches of the courtroom, interviews with spectators. They made the case a public event, a spectacle, and in doing so, they ensured that it could not be quietly swept aside. But the press also sensationalized the story. They focused on the salacious details, the affair, the poison, the wealthy widow. They portrayed Pettit as a monster and Hattie as a saint, neither of which was entirely accurate. Pettit was a flawed, selfish, manipulative man, but he was still human, still capable of fear and regret and suffering. Hattie was kind and patient and good, but she was also a real person, not a plaster saint, and reducing her to a symbol does her a disservice. The press coverage also contributed to the division in the community. People who supported Pettit felt that the newspapers were biased, that they were conducting a witch hunt, that they were denying him a fair trial by poisoning public opinion against him. People who believed in his guilt felt that the press was finally holding him accountable, finally giving voice to the truth that had been suppressed for too long. Both perspectives had some validity. The press was biased, and their coverage did influence public opinion. But it is also true that without the press, the case might never have been pursued, that the authorities might have been content to let Hattie's death remain officially attributed to malaria, that Pettit and Clemmy might have gone on with their lives unpunished. The role of the church in the case is also complex. On one hand, the church failed Hattie. Ministers like Reverend Hickman heard her complaints, knew she was suffering, and did nothing effective to help her. They counseled submission and patience, when what she needed was protection and support. They prioritized the sanctity of marriage over the safety of the wife, and that failure had fatal consequences. On the other hand, it was a minister, George Switzer, who ultimately brought Pettit to justice. It was the Methodist Conference that expelled Pettit from the ministry, that acknowledged his wrongdoing, that refused to protect him simply because he was one of their own. The church, as an institution, is made up of individuals, and those individuals responded differently to the crisis. Some failed, some rose to the occasion, some were complicit, and some were heroic. The lesson, perhaps, is that institutions are only as good as the people who comprise them, and that we cannot assume an institution will act righteously simply because it claims to represent God or justice or truth. Institutions must be held accountable, must be questioned, must be reformed when they fail. And individuals within those institutions must have the courage to speak up, to challenge authority, to insist on doing what is right even when it is difficult or unpopular. The Pettit case also illustrates the limitations of forensic science in the 19th century. Today, we have DNA testing, advanced toxicology, digital forensics. We can determine cause of death with a high degree of certainty, can trace poisons to their sources, can build cases on microscopic evidence. But in 1889, none of that existed. The tests for strychnine were relatively crude, the chain of custody was poorly documented, and the interpretation of results was subject to debate. And yet, despite these limitations, the prosecution was able to prove its case. They did so not through science alone, but through a combination of science, witness testimony, motive, and circumstantial evidence. They built a narrative that made sense, that explained the facts, that convinced a jury. This is still how most criminal cases are won or lost, not through a single smoking gun piece of evidence, but through the accumulation of many smaller pieces, each one adding weight until the conclusion becomes inescapable. The defense's strategy, conversely, was to sow doubt. They did not need to prove Pettit's innocence. They only needed to convince the jury that the prosecution had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. They attacked the credibility of witnesses, questioned the reliability of the toxicology, suggested alternative explanations, and portrayed Pettit as a victim of circumstance and prejudice. This is a standard defense strategy, and it often works. Juries are instructed to presume innocence, to require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they take that responsibility seriously. But in the Pettit case, the strategy failed. The evidence was too strong, the motive too clear, the behavior too suspicious. The jury concluded that Pettit was guilty, and they were willing to say so publicly, to condemn one of their own community's leaders, to accept the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived. The verdict was a triumph for the legal system, a demonstration that even the powerful could be held accountable. But it was also a tragedy, a recognition that the system had failed to prevent the crime in the first place, that Hattie had died despite numerous opportunities for intervention. This tension, between the success of the trial and the failure of prevention, is at the heart of the case. Justice was done, in the sense that the guilty party was punished. But justice was not done, in the sense that the victim was not protected, that the crime was allowed to occur, that Clemmy escaped prosecution. Perfect justice is perhaps an impossible standard. The legal system can only respond to crimes after they happen. It cannot prevent all evil, cannot protect all victims, cannot ensure that every guilty party is punished. It is a blunt, imperfect tool, constrained by the need for evidence, for due process, for the presumption of innocence. But imperfect justice is still better than no justice at all. And the Pettit case, for all its flaws and failures, stands as an example of a community that refused to let a crime go unpunished, that fought for accountability, that insisted on the truth even when it was painful and divisive. As the years passed and the 20th century progressed, attitudes toward marriage, toward women's rights, toward the role of religion in public life, all began to shift. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum, leading eventually to the 19th Amendment in 1920. Divorce became more socially acceptable, more legally accessible. The authority of ministers and other religious leaders was increasingly questioned, especially in the wake of scandals and the rise of more secular modes of thought. These changes did not happen quickly, and they did not happen uniformly. In rural Indiana, in communities like Shawnee Mound, traditional values persisted longer than they did in urban areas. But even there, the old certainties were eroding, the old hierarchies were being challenged, and women like Hattie were beginning to have more options, more protections, more voices. It is tempting to see the Pettit case as a relic of a different era, a story from a time when women were powerless and ministers were untouchable. But that would be a mistake. The dynamics that led to Hattie's death, the abuse of power, the manipulation, the silence of institutions, the prioritization of reputation over safety, these are not relics. They persist, in different forms, in different contexts, but they persist. We still see cases where powerful men abuse their positions, where victims are not believed, where institutions close ranks to protect their own. We still see marriages where one partner is trapped, where leaving seems impossible, where asking for help leads to platitudes rather than protection. We still see communities that would rather deny uncomfortable truths than confront them, that would rather blame victims than hold perpetrators accountable. The specifics have changed. Women today have more legal rights, more economic independence, more social support than Hattie did. But the fundamental patterns, the ways power operates, the ways abuse hides behind respectability, these remain disturbingly familiar. And so the Pettit case is not just a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder, a mirror. It asks us to look at our own communities, our own institutions, our own assumptions, and to question whether we are doing enough to protect the vulnerable, to challenge the powerful, to insist on justice even when it is inconvenient. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the question of what Hattie knew, and when she knew it. Did she realize she was being poisoned? Did she suspect that the woman nursing her, bringing her food and drink, was the same woman who had stolen her husband and was now helping to kill her? Or did she die still trusting, still believing that Clemmy was a friend, that the illness was natural, that she would recover? We cannot know. Hattie left no diary, no letters from her final days. We have only the accounts of others, and they tell us little about her inner state. We know she was in pain, that she was confused, that she called for her husband. But we do not know what she understood about her own situation. It is possible that she suspected, that in her lucid moments, between the waves of nausea and the convulsions, she put the pieces together. She knew her husband was having an affair. She knew he wanted to be free of her. She knew she was dying, and that the symptoms were strange, unlike anything she had experienced before. Perhaps she understood, in some deep, terrible way, that she was being murdered. But even if she did, what could she have done? She was weak, bedridden, dependent on the very people who were killing her. She had no power, no allies, no way to escape. Or perhaps she did not suspect. Perhaps she died believing that God was taking her, that this was simply her time, that her suffering had a purpose and a meaning. Perhaps she found some comfort in that belief, some peace in the idea that her death was natural and inevitable. We cannot know, and perhaps it does not matter. Either way, she suffered. Either way, she died. Either way, she was betrayed by the people she should have been able to trust. The question of Clemmy's motivation is equally difficult to answer. Why did she do it? Why did she participate in the murder, or at the very least, stand by while it happened? The obvious answer is that she wanted to marry Pettit, and Hattie was in the way. But this explanation feels insufficient. Clemmy was wealthy, independent, intelligent. She did not need a husband. She could have continued her affair with Pettit indefinitely, or she could have ended it and found someone else. Why resort to murder? One possibility is that Clemmy was genuinely in love with Pettit, that she was willing to do anything to be with him, that her judgment was clouded by emotion. Love, or what passes for love, can drive people to terrible acts. It can make them reckless, ruthless, willing to cross lines they never imagined they would cross. Another possibility is that Clemmy enjoyed the power of it, that she liked the idea of taking what she wanted, of bending the world to her will, of proving that she could get away with anything. This theory paints her as a sociopath, someone without empathy or conscience, someone for whom other people are simply objects to be used or discarded as convenient. A third possibility is that Clemmy was coerced, that Pettit pressured her, manipulated her, convinced her that there was no other way. This theory is more sympathetic, but it requires us to believe that a woman of Clemmy's intelligence and strength could be so completely dominated by a man. It is possible, but it seems inconsistent with what we know of her character. The truth is probably some combination of all three. Clemmy was in love, or thought she was. She was also arrogant, confident in her ability to avoid consequences. And she was influenced by Pettit, a man who was skilled at manipulation, who knew how to make people see things his way. Together, they created a situation where murder seemed acceptable, even necessary, and they proceeded with it. But again, we are speculating. Clemmy never explained herself, never justified her actions, never gave us any insight into her thoughts or feelings. She took her secrets to the grave, and they remain buried with her. The broader cultural context of the case is also worth considering. The late 19th century was a time of significant social change in America. The country was industrializing, urbanizing, moving away from its agrarian roots. Traditional structures, the church, the family, the small community, were under pressure. People were more mobile, more independent, less bound by the old rules and expectations. This created opportunities, but it also created anxieties. Many people felt that society was becoming more chaotic, more immoral, that the old verities were being lost. There was a sense of nostalgia for a simpler, more virtuous past, a past that probably never existed, but that people longed for nonetheless. In this context, the Pettit case was deeply disturbing. It suggested that even the institutions that were supposed to anchor society, the church, the family, could not be trusted. It suggested that ministers, the moral guides of the community, could be as corrupt and self-serving as anyone else. It suggested that the surface of respectability could hide profound evil. The trial, then, was not just about Pettit's guilt or innocence. It was about whether the community could reassert control, could punish wrongdoing, could restore some sense of order and justice. The verdict was a statement: we will not tolerate this. We will not allow our institutions to be corrupted. We will hold people accountable, no matter who they are. But the victory was incomplete, because Clemmy was not punished. And that incompleteness left a bitter taste, a sense that justice had been served only partially, that the powerful could still, to some extent, escape the consequences of their actions. The case also raises questions about the nature of evil. Was Pettit evil? Was Clemmy? Or were they simply weak, selfish people who made terrible choices? There is a tendency, in discussing crimes like this, to want to label the perpetrators as monsters, as fundamentally different from the rest of us. This is comforting. It allows us to believe that we would never do such a thing, that we are incapable of such evil, that the capacity for murder exists only in a small subset of humanity. But this is almost certainly false. Most people, given the right circumstances, are capable of terrible acts. Not everyone would commit murder, but more people than we would like to believe could be pushed to it, especially if they convinced themselves they had a good reason, if they dehumanized the victim, if they believed they could get away with it. Pettit and Clemmy were not monsters. They were human beings, with human flaws and human desires. They wanted things, love, wealth, freedom, and they were willing to hurt others to get them. That does not excuse what they did, but it does make it more understandable and more frightening, because it suggests that the line between ordinary selfishness and murderous cruelty is thinner than we like to think. The role of gender in the case is also significant. Pettit was a man, a minister, a figure of authority. Clemmy was a woman, but a wealthy widow, which gave her a degree of independence and power that most women lacked. Hattie was a woman, but a dependent one, without resources or options. The power dynamics between these three people were shaped by gender, but also by class, by social status, by institutional affiliation. Pettit's power came from his position in the church and the lodge. Clemmy's power came from her wealth. Hattie had no power, and that lack of power made her vulnerable, made her a target, made her expendable. If Hattie had been wealthy, if she had had family nearby, if she had had some means of supporting herself, would she have stayed in the marriage? Probably not. She would have left, would have divorced Pettit, would have built a new life somewhere else. But she did not have those options, and so she stayed, and staying killed her. This is not to say that wealth is a guarantee of safety, or that all poor women are victims. But it is to say that power matters, that resources matter, that the ability to leave a bad situation matters. And Hattie did not have that ability, and the society she lived in did not provide it to her. The case also highlights the importance of believing victims. Hattie told people she was unhappy. She told Reverend Hickman that her husband was cold to her, that he drank, that he disappeared without explanation. She asked for help. And what did she get? Sympathy, perhaps, but not action, not intervention, not protection. Why? partly because the people she confided in did not take her seriously. They saw her complaints as the normal grievances of a wife, as something to be endured rather than addressed. They did not imagine that the situation could escalate to violence, to murder. They did not believe that a minister, a respected man, could be a threat. This is a pattern that repeats itself over and over. Women report abuse, and they are not believed. They are told they are exaggerating, that they are being too sensitive, that they should try harder to make the relationship work. And then, when the abuse escalates, when someone is injured or killed, people express shock and say they had no idea it was that bad. But often, the signs were there. Often, the victim tried to communicate. Often, people chose not to listen, not to believe, not to act. And that choice, that failure to believe, that failure to act, has consequences. If Reverend Hickman had taken Hattie's complaints more seriously, if he had confronted Pettit more forcefully, if he had helped Hattie find a way out of the marriage, would she have survived? We cannot know. But the aftermath of the trial left Crawfordsville in a peculiar state. There was relief, certainly, that Pettit had been convicted, that some measure of justice had been achieved. But there was also unease, a lingering sense that the case had exposed something rotten at the heart of the community, something that could not be entirely excised by a single verdict. People began to question other aspects of their lives, other relationships, other assumptions. If a minister could be a murderer, what else might be true that they had never considered? If the institutions they trusted could fail so catastrophically, what other failures might be lurking beneath the surface? Some people responded by becoming more vigilant, more skeptical, more willing to question authority. They paid closer attention to the behavior of their leaders, both religious and civic. They were less willing to give people the benefit of the doubt simply because of their position or reputation. They insisted on transparency, on accountability, on evidence. Others responded by retreating into denial, by insisting that the Pettit case was an anomaly, a one-time failure that did not reflect any broader problems. They wanted to believe that their community was fundamentally good, that their institutions were fundamentally sound, that what had happened was an aberration rather than a symptom. Both responses are understandable. It is difficult to live in a state of constant skepticism, to question everything, to trust no one. But it is also dangerous to be too trusting, to ignore warning signs, to assume that people in positions of power will always act in good faith. The healthiest response is probably somewhere in the middle, to trust but verify, to give people a chance but to pay attention to their actions, to support institutions but to hold them accountable when they fail. This is not easy. It requires effort, vigilance, a willingness to be uncomfortable. But it is necessary if we want to prevent tragedies like Hattie's death from happening again. The physical spaces associated with the case gradually changed or disappeared. The house where Hattie died was eventually torn down, replaced by newer construction. The church where Pettit preached was demolished and rebuilt. The Masonic Lodge moved to a different building. The landscape was transformed, and with it, the physical reminders of what had happened. But memory persists in other ways. In stories passed down through families. In local histories written by dedicated researchers. In court records preserved in archives. In newspaper articles yellowed with age but still readable. The case lives on, not as a present reality, but as a historical fact, a story that can be studied, analyzed, learned from. For those who take the time to delve into the details, the case offers lessons that are still relevant today. It teaches us about the dynamics of abusive relationships, about the ways power can be abused, about the importance of listening to victims. It teaches us about the role of institutions, about how they can protect or fail to protect, about the need for reform and accountability. It teaches us about the nature of justice, about what it can and cannot achieve, about the difference between legal punishment and true healing. The case also raises eternal questions about guilt and innocence, about responsibility and complicity. Pettit was convicted and punished. But what about the others? What about Reverend Hickman, who knew Hattie was suffering but did not do enough to help? What about Dr. Yeager, who misdiagnosed her illness and allowed the poisoning to continue? What about the neighbors who saw the affair but said nothing? What about the community that trusted Pettit too easily and questioned him too late? These people were not criminals. They broke no laws, but they failed nonetheless. They failed to protect Hattie, failed to challenge Pettit, failed to demand accountability from their institutions. Their failures were sins of omission rather than commission, but they were failures nonetheless. And what about us, reading this story more than a century later? What failures are we complicit in? What warning signs are we ignoring? What victims are we failing to believe? The questions are uncomfortable, but they are worth asking. One of the most striking aspects of the case, when viewed from a modern perspective, is how little has changed in some ways, and how much has changed in others. The legal system still struggles to address domestic violence, still often fails to protect victims until it is too late. Powerful men still abuse their positions, still manipulate and deceive. Institutions still close ranks to protect their own, still prioritize reputation over truth. But there have been changes too. Women have more rights, more resources, more options for escaping abusive situations. Forensic science has advanced dramatically, making it harder to commit murder and get away with it. Society is more willing to question authority, more skeptical of claims of virtue, more insistent on evidence. These changes did not happen automatically. They happened because people fought for them, because victims spoke up, because advocates demanded reform, because communities refused to accept the status quo. They happened because people remembered cases like the Pettit case and decided that such things should never happen again. But the work is not finished. There are still victims who are not believed, still abusers who escape justice, still institutions that fail to protect. There are still Hatties, trapped in situations they cannot escape, asking for help that does not come. And there are still Pettits, charming and manipulative, using positions of trust to harm others. The question is what we will do about it. Will we pay attention? Will we believe victims when they speak up? Will we hold institutions accountable when they fail? Will we create systems that protect the vulnerable rather than the powerful? Or will we, like so many in Crawfordsville in the 1880s, choose to look away, to trust too easily, to assume that everything is fine until it is too late? The Pettit case demands that we confront these questions. It does not provide easy answers, but it insists that we ask. And in asking, in remembering, in refusing to forget, we honor Hattie's memory and the memory of all those who have suffered similar fates. George Switzer's persistence in pursuing the case is worth reflecting on further. He was not a perfect man, and his motivations were probably mixed. He may have genuinely cared about justice for Hattie, but he may also have enjoyed the attention, the sense of righteousness, the power that came from being the person who brought down a corrupt minister. But even if his motivations were mixed, his actions mattered. Without Switzer, the case would likely have been buried. Hattie's death would have been recorded as malaria. Pettit would have gone on with his life, and Clemmy would have kept her wealth and her status. The truth would have been suppressed, and justice would not have been served. Switzer was willing to be unpopular. He was willing to be attacked, to be accused of slander, to be labeled a troublemaker. He was willing to endure criticism from people he had once considered friends. He did not back down when it would have been easier to do so, did not give up when the authorities refused to act, did not accept defeat when the first grand jury declined to indict. This kind of persistence is rare, and it is valuable. Social change, justice for victims, accountability for the powerful, these things do not happen without people willing to fight for them. They do not happen without people like Switzer, stubborn and relentless, refusing to let go. But Switzer's example also raises questions about vigilantism and the danger of witch hunts. How do we balance the need for persistent advocacy with the need for fairness and due process? How do we ensure that people like Switzer are fighting for truth rather than pursuing vendettas? How do we distinguish between righteous persistence and destructive obsession? These are difficult questions, and the Pettit case does not provide definitive answers. But it does suggest that both extremes are dangerous. Too much deference to authority, too much willingness to believe official explanations, can allow crimes to go unpunished. But too much zeal, too much willingness to condemn without evidence, can lead to injustice of a different kind. The ideal is a system that encourages questioning, that welcomes whistleblowers, that takes accusations seriously, but that also insists on evidence, on fairness, on the presumption of innocence. Such a system is hard to achieve and even harder to maintain, but it is worth striving for. The question of what happened to the strychnine, where it came from, who obtained it, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. The prosecution theorized that Pettit had acquired it despite being turned away by the pharmacist, perhaps from another source. But they never proved this conclusively. It is also possible that Clemmy obtained the poison. She had resources, connections, and the intelligence to do so without arousing suspicion. She could have purchased it in another town, or acquired it through someone else, or had it on hand from before her husband's death. Or perhaps the poison was already in the house, left over from some legitimate use, killing rats or treating livestock, and Pettit simply took advantage of its availability. This theory is less satisfying, because it suggests opportunism rather than premeditation, but it is possible. The truth is we do not know, and we will never know. The evidence that might have answered this question has been lost to time. All we can say with certainty is that strychnine was present, that it was administered to Hattie, and that it killed her. The details of how it was obtained are ultimately less important than the fact that it was used. But the question matters, in a way, because it speaks to the level of premeditation involved. If Pettit went to great lengths to obtain the poison, if he planned the murder carefully over weeks or months, that suggests a cold, calculated decision. If he simply took advantage of poison that happened to be available, that suggests a more impulsive act, though no less criminal. The law distinguishes between premeditated murder and crimes of passion, between acts that are planned and acts that are spontaneous. But in Hattie's case, the distinction seems academic. Whether the decision to kill her was made days or weeks in advance, whether the poison was carefully obtained or simply seized upon, the result was the same. She suffered. She died. And the people responsible went on with their lives, at least for a time. The question of Pettit's state of mind during Hattie's final days is also haunting. What was he thinking as he watched her suffer? Did he feel guilt? Did he wish he could undo what he had done? Or did he simply wait, impatient for it to be over, eager to begin his new life with Clemmy? We have some clues from his behavior. He was often absent from the house during Hattie's illness. He did not seem particularly concerned about her suffering. He made arrangements for the funeral even before she died, as if he knew it was inevitable. These actions suggest a man who was focused on the future, on what came next, rather than on the present reality of his wife's agony. But we also know that Pettit was a skilled performer, someone who knew how to present the emotions people expected to see. Perhaps he was tormented by guilt, racked with regret, and simply hid it behind a facade of calm efficiency. Perhaps his absence from the house was not indifference, but avoidance, an inability to witness the consequences of his actions. Or perhaps he felt nothing at all. Perhaps he was a sociopath, incapable of empathy, viewing Hattie as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person with thoughts and feelings and a right to live. This interpretation is the darkest, but it may be the most accurate. We cannot know what was in Pettit's heart. We can only judge him by his actions, and his actions were monstrous. He poisoned his wife. He watched her die. He tried to cover it up. And when he was caught, he lied, denied, fought to avoid accountability. Whatever he felt, whatever he thought, his choices were clear, and they were unforgivable. The trial itself, beyond the legal arguments and the testimony, was a social event of significant magnitude. Crawfordsville had never seen anything quite like it. The courtroom was packed every day, with people arriving hours early to secure a seat. Those who could not get inside stood in the hallways, on the courthouse steps, in the street, hoping to catch a glimpse of the defendant, the lawyers, the witnesses. Journalists from newspapers across Indiana attended, along with reporters from Chicago and other major cities. They sent dispatches by telegraph, and their coverage ensured that the case was followed not just locally, but throughout the Midwest. People who had never heard of Crawfordsville or Shawnee Mound now knew the names Pettit, Hattie, and Clemmy Whitehead. The presence of Lew Wallace added a touch of celebrity to the proceedings. Wallace was one of the most famous men in America at the time, the author of Ben-Hur, which had become a massive bestseller and would later be adapted into one of the most successful films of the silent era. Wallace was also a former Civil War general and had served as governor of New Mexico Territory. His interest in the case gave it added legitimacy, suggested that it was important, worthy of attention from serious people. Wallace attended several days of the trial, sitting in the gallery, taking notes. He was fascinated by the legal arguments, by the dynamics of the courtroom, by the characters involved. Some historians have speculated that elements of the Pettit case may have influenced Wallace's later writings, though there is no definitive evidence of this. The presence of spectators also created a kind of pressure on the jury. They were making their decision not in private, but in full view of their community, knowing that their verdict would be dissected, debated, and judged. This pressure could have pushed them toward caution, toward acquittal in the face of any doubt. But it could also have pushed them toward conviction, toward a desire to demonstrate that they would not tolerate such crimes, that they would hold the powerful accountable. In the event, the jury convicted, and the community, for the most part, approved. There were dissenters, people who thought the verdict was wrong, who believed Pettit had been railroaded. But they were in the minority. Most people, after hearing the evidence, after seeing the witnesses, after deliberating in their own minds, concluded that Pettit was guilty and that justice had been served. The physical evidence in the case, such as it was, played a crucial role. The strychnine found in Hattie's body was the single most important piece of evidence. Without it, the case would have been almost impossible to prove. The affair, the suspicious circumstances, the hasty funeral, all of these created suspicion, but they did not prove murder. The strychnine did. This highlights the importance of forensic science in criminal justice. Before the development of reliable methods for detecting poisons, for analyzing blood and tissue, for establishing cause of death scientifically, many poisoners got away with their crimes. Poison was the ideal weapon for someone who wanted to commit murder without violence, without witnesses, without leaving obvious evidence. It looked like natural death, especially if the victim was already ill, and unless someone suspected foul play and ordered an autopsy, the crime went undetected. The late 19th century saw significant advances in toxicology, in chemistry, in the scientific analysis of evidence. These advances made it harder to commit murder by poison and escape detection. The Pettit case was one of many during this period where science played a decisive role in securing a conviction. But science is only as good as the people using it. The toxicologist in the Pettit case was competent, careful, and credible. But there have been many cases, both before and since, where forensic evidence was mishandled, misinterpreted, or fabricated. Experts can be wrong. Tests can produce false results. Evidence can be contaminated. This is why the legal system insists on adversarial proceedings, on the right to cross-examine witnesses, on the opportunity for the defense to challenge the prosecution's evidence. It is why convictions should not rest on a single piece of evidence, no matter how compelling, but on the totality of the evidence, evaluated carefully and skeptically. In the Pettit case, the forensic evidence was strong, but it was not the only evidence. The testimony of witnesses, the timeline of events, the motive, the behavior of the accused, all of these supported the conclusion that Hattie had been murdered. The strychnine confirmed it, but the case would have been suspicious even without it. The question of whether Clemmy should have been prosecuted continues to be debated by those who study the case. Some argue that the decision not to prosecute was pragmatic and correct, that the evidence against her was too weak to secure a conviction, that trying her and losing would have been worse than not trying her at all. Others argue that the decision was a failure of justice, that Clemmy was as guilty as Pettit, that she should have been made to face a jury, and that her wealth and gender should not have protected her from accountability. Both arguments have merit. From a purely legal standpoint, the prosecution's decision was defensible. They had convicted Pettit, and without his cooperation, without his testimony implicating Clemmy, the case against her was circumstantial. She had motive and opportunity, but so did Pettit, and he had already been convicted. Proving that she, too, was actively involved, that she had administered the poison or conspired to do so, would have been difficult. From a moral standpoint, the decision feels wrong. Clemmy benefited from Hattie's death. She was there during the final days. She had the means and the motive. Even if she did not personally administer the poison, even if she was merely a passive accomplice, she was complicit. And complicity, while perhaps not legally sufficient for a conviction, is morally blameworthy. The fact that she was never even charged, never even made to answer for her actions in a formal setting, suggests that the legal system was willing to give her a pass, to treat her differently than it treated Pettit. And the most likely reasons for this differential treatment are her wealth and her gender. Wealthy defendants have always had advantages in the legal system. They can afford better lawyers, can drag out proceedings, can use their resources to intimidate witnesses or influence outcomes. This was true in the 19th century, and it remains true today. Gender also played a role. Juries in the 19th century were reluctant to convict women of serious crimes, especially crimes involving violence. There was a cultural assumption that women were gentler, more moral, less capable of such acts. This assumption was paternalistic and often wrong, but it influenced verdicts nonetheless. Clemmy benefited from both of these biases. She had the money to fight a prosecution, and she had the gender that made juries sympathetic. And so she escaped, not because she was innocent, but because the system was willing to let her go. This is a failure, but it is a failure that has been repeated countless times, in countless cases, across centuries. The law is supposed to be blind, to treat all defendants equally regardless of wealth, status, or identity. But in practice, the law is rarely blind. It sees wealth. It sees power. It sees gender and race and class. And it adjusts its judgments accordingly. The Pettit case is a reminder of this uncomfortable truth and a challenge to do better, to create systems that are truly fair, that hold all people accountable regardless of who they are or how much money they have. The emotional toll of the case on those involved is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. For Hattie's family, the trial brought some measure of closure, but it could not erase the grief, the sense of loss, the knowledge that Hattie had died alone and in agony. They had to live with the fact that they had not been there to protect her, that they had not known what was happening until it was too late. For the witnesses, particularly the servants like Ollie Reese, testifying was an act of courage. They risked retaliation, social ostracism, professional consequences. They testified anyway, because they believed it was right, because they wanted justice for Hattie. But the act of testifying, of reliving the events, of being cross-examined and doubted, took a toll. For the lawyers, the trial was a professional triumph or a defeat, depending on